Well, thank you all for coming. It's an absolute honor and privilege to be able to share my work with you today. And I thank you so much, friends from far and near. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Kelly and Mustafa, for being so supportive and awesome to work with. Kelly's not wrong. This work did develop in the space. And Kelly would walk up and all I had to say was, well, it's going to be installed more better. That was kind of, so thank you for the patience and trusting, and if you were nervous, you didn't share it, so thank you very much. All right, so I get asked all the time, how did you get here? Where did this come from? And especially from students. And so today I'm going to attempt to show you sort of the progression from the very beginning, right? So back when I was a student, especially when I talk at a college or a university, I like to show work I was making while I was at a college and university. So we're going to start way back and then work our way through pivotal works that sort of changed and led to a new thing and another body of work. All right, so as Kelly said, I grew up in Fort Bragg on the Mendocino coast. And as far as California standards go, that's a pretty small town. So for college, I moved to Redding, the booming metropolis of Redding, California, which was a big shift for me at the time. I attended Shasta College, and that was my first introduction to sculpture. I'd never really made sculpture before Shasta College. This was my very first sculpture, and it was found objects. So right from the beginning, finding materials, assembling them into new objects was really sort of the core of what I was doing. And I really focused on making objects that felt like machines, like they should be doing something, but they weren't moving yet. And so I wasn't altering the materials in any way, but I was transforming them into trying to, almost like you had just found this object somewhere. That was kind of the goal. Almost like, you came across this object already put together. My final piece there at Shasta was, so Redding had this awesome scrapyard, like legit old school scrapyard, like train tracks, magnets, claws, the whole thing. And you could go in there and literally rummage through these heap piles of scrap metal. I don't know how that was legal, but you would go in there and just rummage around and then get a cart and pay by the pound to get this material. So I would go there all the time to find things, and I found this bent up piece of steel and put this TV tube in it, and then went back to the junkyard, shot a video, got kicked out, and then used the video which played on this kind of tube. So that was my first video interaction of sort of a time-based work, getting video incorporated with the sculpture. So this is a bad drawing. It was a bad drawing when I made it, and it's still a bad drawing, but it was a very pivotal drawing for me. So up until this point, I had made work that I would render it well, right? So I was making lifelike images, and one of the main motivations was I wanted people to tell me I was a good artist, right? And one of the easiest ways to do that was to draw something lifelike or somebody thought was cool. I'd show it to them. They'd be like, oh, you're an awesome artist. And with this drawing, I was like, I'm so sick of doing that. And so I tried to kind of draw a song. And so I used color and I let the drawing be loose. And it was from that point forward that I was like, holy cow, I can really just explore these other things and not necessarily rendering or making something lifelike. And so that was a real pivotal piece. Artists I was looking at while I was at Shasta, Eva Hess, huge influence on my work, a lot of abstract expressionism I was looking at, and then Joan Mitchell. So I actually wanted to be a painter when I was at Shasta College. Joan Mitchell was I wanted to be Joan Mitchell when I grow up. I still want to be Joan Mitchell when I grow up. But huge influence on my work. So after there, I went to the College of Creative Studies at Sacramento City College, and this was my first experience with making installation sculpture. So I really started pushing scale. So instead of making smaller objects, I wanted to engage space, and that's something I'm still interested in. Is how can I engage this entire space and not make something that goes on a pedestal? And there's nothing wrong with that. There's lots of awesome work, but this became a real interest of mine. And I still was finding found objects, so this piece started with those ski boots, and I was just like, oh, these are cool, what can I do with them? And then I turned them into, I called this moon boots, and I wanted them to feel like they were like a big machine, sort of like walking. Same with this work. So this work, I found these drill bits, and then came up with an idea of how to engage that entire space. While at UC Santa Barbara, I also made my first kinetic sculpture. So up until now, I was making objects that just looked like they should move. And so this piece had an air compressor, and then air would be pushed into these tubes, and these tubes would lift up in the air. It was a very simple movement, but that was a big step for me because it was moving into actually making these things move rather than just looking like they should move. So like Kelly said, growing up in Fort Bragg, I also started to pull materials from that space. So fog, or that upbringing. So fog was one of the things that's a very memorable part of being on the coast. If you've been to Fort Bragg, it's foggy a lot. So I started building these fog boxes. And the fog boxes were these clear plex back boxes. They would fill with fog, and I was also starting to use redwood during that time, kind of bringing these elements in. I still didn't really know what I was making, like why I was making it. I knew I had to draw to these materials, to these mechanical objects, but I wasn't sure what the purpose was. It was a very intuitive process. So that was where this came into play. This was the senior show, so I had made all this work. I was graduating. This was the final installation I did at UCSB. And I walked into the gallery, and I just felt completely exposed. It was like a flashlight, or like a spotlight was on every single piece, and I was like, whoa, that piece is about that piece is about that. Nobody else saw that, but I was just like, for the first time I really realized that these intuitive decisions and these draws to these materials were making direct connections to personal experience, kind of a personal narrative. So while I was at Santa Barbara, I got to go down to LA. There was a rad class where we just did field trips to LA to go look at art. And so I saw Tim Hawkinson's work. I got to see the Uber organ. And these were artists who, I was speaking a similar language, but they were just like light years ahead, obviously, right? And so they really spoke to me, and I was really drawn to them. Dan Flavin. So I got to see a retrospective at LACMA. Most people, well, usually I would see like one little fluorescent light in a corner of a museum and just be like, oh, whatever, right? But seeing these installations where the artist is playing with light and color to transform space was super influential to me. So I'm going to jump ahead now. So that was 2007 when I graduated, and in 2012 I got my MFA, so I went back to school in 2010, and this is my thesis work. So with this work was my first time of starting to take individual elements and pieces, which in the past I would have displayed separately, and started combining them and stacking them into these kind of large-scale installations. Kinetics were an important part, so I carried on with the sort of final works from UCSB and kept making things that moved. And this work got kind of very sterile. I was focused on sort of male mentorship, rites of passage, bonding rituals that I experienced growing up. And for this piece, I was focused specifically on an art mentor who I had had. And kind of taking looking at the whole picture, right? Because I got some really excellent things from that person, but I also saw some things that I would like to let go of. So it was sort of trying to look at the whole picture and giving and taking, if that makes sense. So there was like sketchbooks that I made from my time working with them. They always wore a fishing vest full of art supplies, and so you see I did a performance and then used these parts of from the performances elements and included them into the work. Abalone shell, so abalone diving was like a huge rite of passage growing up on the coast. When you reached a certain age, everyone would go and abalone dive. There was 3 big works in this piece. This one was bunker. This was my first inflatable work, and using sports paraphernalia because that was kind of a big bonding ritual for us. This one had a log that would spin, and so that's like a player piano. And those micro switches would run the surface of the log and then control the sculpture. This part's really funny. So I like to use humor in my work as well. Like this, well, anyways, when I was a kid, I used to have to shovel and clean up after my dog. And you would be like running with a shovel like this and trying not to lose the stuff. And so that thing actually shakes, and those little pink things in there like jiggle around. So I like to use humor, funny little parts in the work. So let me play this video of Totem, which was the first work that you saw, so you can get a sense of the movement. All right, so that was Totem, and that was my final. Those three works were what I presented for my thesis at UC Davis, and I graduated. There we go. And moved on. So Kimberly and I, my wife Kimberly and I moved to Vacaville. It was going to be sort of a nice middle ground for figuring out what the heck happened next, right? Like, it was in between the Bay Area, in between Sacramento. I was looking for teaching jobs, rented a studio, like a warehouse there. And it was kind of a nice rest space, not rest, but like a in-between space. And during that time, I didn't have any shows or anything, so I was able to really focus on honing new skills. And so what I really did is I focused on control. And so up until that time, you'll see these fog machine timers. Back in 2012, maybe it's easier now, but to find a simple mechanism that would do like seconds on, seconds off, seconds on, seconds off, is actually really hard. You can find hours, for a house or something like that. So the closest thing I found were these fog machine timers. I would buy them, those Halloween stores that pop up. I would like go on the clearance day and come out with like armfuls of these fog machine timers and take them apart, rewire them, and then use them. But that's very limited, right? There's not a lot of control that you get with them. Like the poor gallery people, to turn this on, it was like, okay, turn the left one on, count to 5. Turn the right one on, count to 5. Like it was like this whole start, it was a nightmare for them. So then I found Arduinos, and Arduinos are a little microcontroller. So this is an Arduino. It's just like a little microcontroller. Runs a very simple loop that allows you a lot more control. So this is what the coding would look like. I started to teach myself how to code, and this is based out of C++. Confession, I'm a very much a code globber. Okay, I'm not terribly good at coding, but I can do it enough. And when I get into trouble, I have friends. Okay? I have friends. I have a friend who is actually teaches computer science, and watching them code is like a thing of beauty. They get they go like this. Like they grab their head. They grab their head. Now, what is it you wanted to do? Can the machine eat itself if both go at the same time, right? And then they write this beautiful code that's like this long, and I'm just like, okay, and then I live off that code for 3 to 5 years until I get stuck again. But anyways, this is the code. Here's some simple experiments that I was doing using relays and switches, where you can see that thing clicking on and off with the stop switch. So when you go and see the New West, you'll see little stop switches where things go and they stop, and those are basically talking to the little microcontroller saying hey, turn this motor on until you hit this switch and then stop, and then go to the next portion of the code. So I was able to learn coding and Arduinos, which was a huge leap in terms of what I could do kinetically in the work. So in 2015, I got to have my first solo exhibition in Oakland, California at Aggregate Space Gallery, and it was called Old Growth. Now, that grad work, you'll notice, was super sterile, right? I had been pulling materials from my upbringing and kind of associating them with memories and experiences, but grad school is it's kind of tough, right? Those of you who are in grad school, those of you who've been there, you're getting poked from every single side. And so I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to put that aside for now, and the work got kind of sterile. But then with Old Growth, I wanted to focus on sort of themes of preservation, decay, life and death, inheritance, lineage. And in order to do that, I wanted to use a more personal material. So then I kind of was drawn back to the redwood. And when I got drawn to it, I wanted to eat it. I don't know how to explain that for those of you who are artists. I didn't eat it, I promise. But I started using hand tools and chisels and planes and carving, where I just wanted to be as close to this material as I could be. In this show, there was 2 big works. On this side, you had Spawning Ground, and then you had Altar, and then the 3 smaller works and videos. It was quite a bit of work there. But this piece called Spawning Ground, I wanted the viewer to feel like they were underwater, and this was my first major sound piece. So first time really finding a sound that I was super interested in and incorporating it into the work. So when you first came up to this piece, there was this surveyor, and this kind of told 2 experiences. So I talked about growing up on the coast, and steelhead fishing was this big thing. We went all the time. We never caught anything. You know, by the time I was fishing the rivers that, you know, my father and my grandfather had fished, like, the populations had dwindled. We also just didn't know what we were doing. But, so anyways, what we have here in this kind of magnifying glass type thing, that's a scale, a fish scale. So I was fishing one time, and I hooked a fish, and all I got was a scale when I reeled it in. So I saved it, because that's normal, right? And then through the other side, that's the first steelhead I had caught, and I had a picture of it, so then I carved it. So you had kind of these two different experiences happening on either side of the space. Underneath this carved steelhead, there's these ball jars, and inside the ball jars, they actually have these vacuum pumps attached to them, so we pull suction on them and make noise. So if you've ever done water bath canning, you set your jars on the counter and then the lid seal and make a beautiful popping sound. And so I wanted to use that sound in the work as well. These golf balls in these jars like jiggle and make like a really soothing sound. So I'm going to play you that video so you can hear some of these sounds and see some stuff going on there. So you get an idea of sort of the sounds and that feeling of kind of being underwater. I wanted this to be sort of feel almost like a sacred space and have more of a meditative feel. So that's kind of what I'm going for with the sounds in my works, is I want them to feel kind of meditative or introspective, where someone can kind of go and have a quiet moment with the sculpture, even in the midst of these like, noise and crazy things going on around them. On the other side of the gallery, this piece was called Altar, and this was sort of a homage to those kind of ways of life that I had seen growing up that were no longer there. So like working in the woods and working for a lumber company, logging and fishing and all those things. So these are actually work gloves, like leather work gloves that were water bath canned inside of jars. Cheap beer. I think it was cheap beer. Maybe it was whiskey. I can't remember. One of those two. But I got really into canning things at the time, and canning fish heads, canning golf balls, canning I don't know, sawdust, all sorts of stuff. Like in a literal like water bath can. Like I would boil up whatever the liquid would be, and I liked using the beer or the whiskey because it gave it that kind of nice amber glow to it. These were some castings of abalone shells. These were the 3 smaller works in that show. All of them were kinetic. This one's kind of funny. So it actually runs off of a police fire scanner. So down at the bottom here, that's another sort of reference back to my childhood. So growing up in a small town, people are super nosy. Maybe people are still nosy in a big town and you just don't know everybody, so it doesn't matter as much. But like, people would literally like sit there with their scanners, like my aunt, this is notorious, right? Scanner right next to her chair. Something happened, phone call, boom, we'd get a call. Hey, do you know there's a fire down at Columbia's Market or whatever, right? And like people would like speed down there and like look you. So like, I was like, I thought that was hilarious, and so I thought the idea of making a sculpture that responded to those fire calls and police calls would be kind of funny. So, all right, so then, that was spawning ground, old growth, and in 2016, a year later, I got invited to be part of a sculpture competition at Oakwald Sculpture Park, an outdoor sculpture park down by Stockton. And we have the judge sitting up there, just over there. Thank you very much. I had fully intended, so I had this idea I was kicking around for the longest time about burying a salmon in the ground with a camera, watching it decay. And I was like, oh, this will be perfect. It's going to integrate with the environment. It's going to be a nice little conclusion to spawning ground. Spawning ground, we got life. Burial ground, we got death. Never going to think about fish ever again in my life, right? Like, I thought it would be a really nice conclusion. Well, two things happened. One, this nice big fish that I had caught got freezer burned in my freezer because it sat there for like a year, and so I had to go buy this farm-raised trout to put in there. And then there's the box. I built this box, put a camera in there, and then connected it to the internet. I'll get to the second problem in just a second. But this is the second problem. So we had a really rainy, surprisingly, winter, and this was springtime, and the water table was like 2 inches below the surface, like 4 inches below the surface. It was like super high. So I dug this big hole and kept bailing the water out, but it just would fill right back up. So we were like, well, the show must go on, right? So we wrapped the whole thing in plastic, sealed it, sunk it with these bricks on top, and then covered it with dirt. And all the viewers saw when they saw this was a QR code on top of that little box. And so they would take a picture of it, and then they could see this like rotting fish inside this, didn't rot, mummified, but inside on their phone. And it was kind of really interesting to me, that disconnect also. We get so much information through our phones. Like, they didn't know whether that fish was really in that box or not, right? But it was, but they didn't, and so I thought that was an interesting play. But instead of decaying, it mummified. Okay? So what had happened is a mold colony grew, and this whole thing got totally moldy, and it was disgusting. And then the mold colony died and like disintegrated off, leaving this transformation. I was just like, my mind was just like blown, right? I had this life cycle of these this mold colony happening inside this whole bigger picture of a life cycle I'm thinking about, and I just was like, got totally obsessed. So, as you have probably noticed in the show. But I'm going to sort of skip ahead, prepare yourselves, it's gross and beautiful, of this video of this trout. So we have our trout, and it was taking a picture every single hour and sending it to my G Drive account. And then I was compiling them and updating the video, so you can see these mold colonies start to grow. It gets real good. Right about there. There we go. Real good. And then the crazy part is when this mold starts like falling off. Right? It like dries up and falls off. Wow, it's so weird. It's still weird to this day. And like I said, so then I was left with this guy. Okay? So that boggled my mind, and I just was like digesting that I'm still digesting it, right? And that led to this body of work, which was in 2017, so a year later at the Pence Gallery in Davis. And this was called Anadromous There and Back Again. And this piece right here was called Old Spawn. And I was trying to figure out what had just happened. right? I really thought that that last piece was going to go a certain way, and it didn't. And so this was trying to kind of merge spawning ground and burial ground together into one piece. And so the back projection there is actually the video that played up above spawning ground. And then obviously I have the fish from burial ground, and then there were these tubes, these glass tubes inside this big drum, and the glass tubes had sand in them. So I was thinking about the sand in a couple ways. The sand was from the actual process of burying the fish, right? So I was thinking about it as a burial. I was also thinking about it as the passage of time. So kind of this life cycle happening all in one piece. There's the fish. This show also had another piece called Twitch. This had this water that was inside these tubes and would make these little twitching movements. So I like to make big movements and like small, subtle movements. I like to, that someone can, wait, did that just happen? Right, like this like little thing, right? And you're not quite sure and you have to wait for it and see, wait for it again. This piece was called Jawbone, and there was a door, that was the actual kind of, not a cabinet. That little box is what was out for burial ground. And then I put this deer jawbone with these like teeth on springs, because that's what you do. And then the door would open and close periodically with this servo. This piece was called Submerged, super hard to photograph. So when I talked about how I was using hand planes and chisels, and so I saved all of that. Right? I saved all of those shavings. I had garbage bags full of like these redwood shavings from making spawning ground. And I put those in this drum. So this is a big drum with plexiglass on the front and the back with paddles, and it would spin and then drop that sand. And then I threw a projection through the back, and it made like this low-tech pseudo hologram. Like, you can't really tell from the picture, but there's salmon swimming through there, like you're underwater. But the salmon looked like they were in the box because you had all this sawdust, like, and it was really, really trippy. So let me play a video of those pieces here so you can get an idea of what the heck they were doing. That was anadromous, and there it is. I won't make you look at it anymore. Maybe I will. There it is, just doesn't want to stop. Okay, so how the heck do I make this stuff, right? Well, there's a lot of things that go into it. I don't have a CNC or anything like that. Everything's pretty much made by hand, and that's a router used like a compass on a piece of plywood to cut those big circles and rings. And then, I get asked also, like, do you have this idea as final finished product in your head? I get, like, it's a great question. Not really, right? I'm making something, I make a change, I react to it, I'm trying different parts together, and it's very much like painting or drawing in that way, because I do draw a lot. So you can kind of see how something develops with different parts and things trying, until finally it's kind of close to that final stage there. All right, so after that, I just leaned into it. I was like, you know what? Anadromous was not enough. I need to figure out why I'm so fascinated in this trout. So I made a mold of the fish. So there's the mold right there. And I started casting different objects into there. I casted plaster, resin, rubber, all sorts of different things. Well, I was able to get a really good 3D scan of the actual casting of the fish, and that allowed me to 3D print it. For those of you who have not seen a 3D printer, this is how it works. There's a PLA plastic, comes on a spool, and it's being pushed through this little heated nozzle, and it places it very specifically on certain spots, and then you end up with little plastic fish, all shapes and sizes, okay? So the biggest one I made was 6 feet. It took 80 different pieces and over 400 hours to print. And there it is, sort of getting mocked up and glued together, and then the finished product there. And so that led all those explorations of laser. I was laser etching. I had thousands of images of this fish mummifying, and so what do you do with those? So I started laser etching them into stamps. If you've been to the show and you got a little print, that's one of those laser etched stamps, and doing it in wood, doing it in acrylic, all sorts of things. So Fish Head was 2019. That was at Art Space 1616 in Sacramento. And I installed 4 big works. So you'll see Old Spawn there, which you saw already. And then we had Red, Buoy, and then we have another piece back here called Robox. I also included 10 small works in this show. So the sound. Sound is a really important part of my sculptures. And I find sound. Just like I find objects or materials, sounds are things that I just discover. So when Kimberly and I moved to our new house, and I brought my studio home, so I was able to move my studio to a shop behind our house. We demolished a whole bunch of things. There's all these workbenches and shelves, and we took it all apart, pulled all the nails, and when we're like cleaning up, I kept hearing these nails like fall and make this chiming noise. I'm like, whoa, that's awesome, right? So then I have to figure out, some sort of machine to reliably recreate this sound over and over again. So what I did is I used electromagnets, and this fire hose would be down, pick up the nails, lift up, and then drop the nails in a sequence. I was using lots of those 3D prints and castings that I was exploring during those times. And here's some examples of some of this kind of mechanics and things going on in that work. Well, let's just do this so you can hear the sound. I'll speed that though. So you can kind of get an idea of the sound that work made. Then there was buoy on the other side. So I have these memories of hearing a whistle buoy. So if anyone's ever lived by the ocean with a harbor, a lot of times there's a bell buoy that's out there making a clang, clang, clang. And then we had this whistle buoy. And it would make this two-tone, like when it goes up, water pressure pushes up through the whistle. and it makes this, this really interesting sound. I live probably a mile and a half from the ocean, but I could hear that, on calm nights. And so I have it like seared into my memory. I also have train whistles in there because I spent a lot of time running around train tracks and running through trestles and that sort of thing. So this piece, buoy, had a few things going on. One, we had these inner tubes going on in there. That was from abalone diving. We would float on these tubes out in the ocean, and then we would dive down each abalone and then put them back in this like float tube up above it. And there was this part of this piece, these antlers move back and forth, and they pull on these strings, which then lift up these black tubes, and inside of there there's water, and as they drop down they play these recorders. Okay, so I had to use recorders because they don't take a reed. All you have to do is force air through them and they'll play whatever note you have taped off or whatever you've done there. So let me play that sound for you. So I wanted that piece to feel like a dream or a memory, sort of this kind of like eerie, soothing, nostalgic sound in the space. This was Crowbox. If something kicks around in my studio and I'm not particularly like the piece too much, it usually gets cannibalized. So you'll see the box here again which has been, this is the third piece now that that box was in. This head right here, you'll see in the show on Skin Deep. I totally stole it, okay? This had those, I like the idea of those kind of like they were growing out of that box. So after every big installation, without fail, I threaten to do works completely on paper. Without fail. I want to do 3x5, and I like watercolor, so I'm just going to make it easy, do it simple, right? So that's how this work started. These series of 10, which I showed at the same time, I was just like, Kimberly, that's it, I've had enough, I'm doing works on paper. And then, of course, they get complicated. So I started gluing the paper to birch plywood and cutting it out and making all these little guys, okay? So referencing, this references a tunnel. I almost called this piece tunnel, and it's actually in this show, which is kind of crazy because Torreya has a piece with a tunnel like right next to it. Anyways, and using laser etching, I got really interested and was looking at some studies at the time about where they were studying the impact of ecosystems that were beyond dams where salmon could no longer reach, and they found out, like, holy cow, like everything's being affected because the salmon aren't bringing the nutrients from the ocean up there and then getting eaten by the bears, and then the bears are going to the bathroom in the woods, and it's fertilizing. It's like this whole crazy thing. So they started bringing up these fish carcasses past the dams to study it. So I like the idea of that kind of that relationship between, in that ecosystem. So I started including tree imagery with these salmon where they felt like they were, kind of integrating with that being like roots going on there. Had a lot of fun making these. It was fun to work on a smaller scale and try and see if I can get some of the same ideas across. And referencing burial grounds, again, anytime that a salmon was under dirt, it was referencing that kind of burying underneath that. Lots of them. Some of these went to homes. That was a nice feeling. You know, you make these big sculptures and they love making them, but then you put them in a box and people don't get to enjoy them all the time. So it was nice to make something that people could take home and enjoy in their homes. And I knew that, you know, they were seeing them and out and about in the world. Okay, so after that, we're almost done, about 5 minutes. Pandemic, right? Worldwide pandemic. What do we do? Crazy times. So for me, it was a very isolated 2 years. I was at home a whole lot, teaching from home, online, in my studio a whole lot. So similar to that time, that break in between grad school and sort of old growth, I took the opportunity to learn some new things. So I learned how to machine stuff, machine metal. So turning, got a metal lathe. This is a metal lathe right here. And you put the material in there, and then you spin it real fast, and you cut it with a tool. That turning, there's a little carbide bit, and you can get super precise with this. So I just geeked out for like 2 years. Super precise. You'll see this is a part that I turned and made like 2 or 3 parts to make, and that's actually the scene on Famous, one of the smaller works. That's the part that rotates around. So this allowed me to really hone and custom build all the mechanics and drives and things for this body of work. So up until then, I was sort of like hacking stuff. Oh, that could work. I'll take that apart from that. Everything was a little like, yeah, we work, kind of, and then we break a lot, right? So this has really allowed me to do something new in the work and improve it. It's been a lot of fun to learn that new skill and to apply it. Also, I got into sewing machines. So I may or may not have like 10 to 12 sewing machines. Maybe? Okay. I really like mechanical things, and I like to fix them up in between bodies of work. So I geeked out hard on sewing machines. And I wasn't sure at the time, like, are they going to be tools to make stuff? Are they going to be sculptures themselves? And so I was like, I don't know. I don't care. I'm just going to get as many as I can get my little paws on right now. So I just started gathering them, fixing them up, which led to sewing the actual inflatable sculptures in this show. Artists that I got to see during this time, Alan Rath. Alan Rath is like a long-lost uncle that I didn't even know existed. And it felt like I got this inheritance. I was like, wait, I didn't know you were alive, right? So I didn't know you were around. So I got to see Alan's work, a retrospective in San Francisco. Right before the pandemic, we got to go to New York. Kimberly and I did, and we saw Hilma Klint at the Guggenheim. So early abstraction, like early 1900s, way before Kandinsky. Spiritualist, awesome imagery, right? Circles, I love circles. The super like symmetrical, sacred feeling paintings. Was absolutely blown away by their work. It was just phenomenal. Also got to see Neri Ward, We the People, which I've been thinking about the textures and the kind of organic tangles in Neri's work for 2 or 3 years now, or since we saw that show. Here's some pictures of some of this. Also, that's dried fish. Okay, so it's the crazy thing about art is two people thinking about the same thing who don't even know each other and aren't even living close to one another. Just like, I saw this piece, that's dried fish chunks. And Neri was talking about a village in Jamaica whose economy is based upon fish, right? I was just like, oh my gosh, like economy based on fish, and I was just totally boggled. Awesome, fun, kindred spirit there. And of course, Joan. Got to see Joan Mitchell, the retrospective, MoMA. Freaking awesome. I just couldn't even believe that show. I still want to be Joan when I grow up, like I said. All right, so that leads us to this work. I mean, this work, I'm still kind of sorting it out, to be honest, especially these big things. Like, Kelly wasn't lying. Like, this work was developing in the space, and I was finishing it up the weekend before the show opened. But what I was doing is taking, kind of responding to the pandemic in a way. So with this work, I was pulling Tyvek, so we started seeing Tyvek suits, everyone wearing these suits. It was such a crazy time, and so I was like, oh my gosh, I need to get some Tyvek, and made this inflatable forest out of it. I liked how it kind of made these trees kind of ghosty, if that makes sense. And when you go into that space, you'll notice they're breathing. So I have them sort of in a sequenced time, so they're kind of moving, and those branches move and create sound and movement into work. I roped some friends into helping me sew those. Jen is here, Jen Strack, and Emily Wilson. I was like, hey, what are you doing on Saturday? Want to come over and have some pizza and maybe sew 100 branches? So we had all these sewing machines set up. We were just like busting them out, and then I was able to make the tubes, the trunks, and then did most of the final installation in the space. So sketchy stuff might have happened, as with this sewing machine on top of this super sturdy looking situation here. Okay, Kelly probably didn't see that. So, I was able to just work it out. There's me working in the space, and some more sort of installation shots of, sewing and figuring out where branches were going to go. Because that's one of the interesting things about installation sculpture is, it's designed specifically for the space. And so I wanted to save a lot of the final aesthetic decisions for while working in the space. This wood is burned on the surface, so we've had so many wildfires. I wanted just a kind of a subtle response to that, nothing too heavy, but this wood was actually given to me by Chris. Thank you, Chris. And it was covered with this paint, and so I was trying to figure out what kind of surface I wanted to put on it. Sorry, wrong direction. So I started resawing it, cutting it into these small boards, and then burning the surface and then sealing the surface with a lacquer, and then cutting it and getting these really clean edges juxtaposed to that burned surface. You'll see these, you'll hear that noise, that bell noise, that's all coming from these saw blades. So you have to look super close, but those actuators right there, they're little plungers, and they tap super fast. It's like 50 milliseconds fast. And you'll see them, they pop on those blades to make that sound. One of the most absurd things about the pandemic to me, not absurd, there's a lot of absurdity, but just a strange thing was our run on toilet paper and just panic. And so I made a mold of some toilet paper. I started dipping it in resin and casting it and putting it in pressure pots and then cutting it to get these kind of tree-like rings going on. And if you'll look, there's actually a little embroidered toilet paper roll on the chest of the figure. So if you go see the show, you'll have to look closely. There's this little embroidered orange toilet paper roll going on with that piece. Skin deep. I wanted this piece to feel lighter, juxtaposed. This piece is kind of intense, the writing chronic isolation, and so I wanted sort of a lighter piece visually next to it. And so this work has a prism in it that spins and refracts the light, and then hits another prism, refracts it further. That's a casting from an abalone shell. Up here you'll see one of those. There's that head I stole. Told you I stole it, but there it is. But this time it's covered in liquid latex and has little fish skins on its head. There were latex, and then that's a petrified toilet paper roll right there. Sometimes I get asked also did you, with this piece per se, someone's like, did you have that idea and then you 3D printed those pieces for it and then made it? Not really. I 3D printed these heads and these tails, and I was like, well, that'd be rad if they kind of sandwiched inside of one another. And I liked this piece in terms of thinking about kind of layers, right? Thinking about generational layers, thinking about personal layers of identity and personality. And then this wreath moves back and forth super slow, and I like to think about that as sort of the constant passage of time, just kind of moving back and forth, and these kind of layered transformations happening on that lower piece. This is, there's these giant fish skins in there. Those are pulled off of that 3D print, that giant 6-foot 3D print. Layers and layers of liquid latex, and then peeled off If anyone's ever tried to do that, it's a real pain. You got to cover them with baby powder because the latex just sticks to itself. So it's like this whole learning process, let me tell you what. All right, then some smaller works. I like to make small work a lot of the time before I start to do a big body work. It helps me kind of think about those ideas. So, reflecting on some of the organic elements like in Terry's work, or, wanting to see if I could bring in something, I tend to work very symmetrically. So like, how can I break that up? And in my sketchbook, I'm drawing organic shapes and forms all the time that are sort of very sculptural, but they never really make it to the work. So I wanted to experiment with that, with these kind of tangles. I was thinking about these as like in a river after a storm, you have the tangle of driftwood and branches and things like that. And famous. This little piece, you saw that right here, that's that piece that I showed you that was machined and spins. Some toilet paper, some fish skins, all the classical actors. Anyways, all right, so that's all I have to say. I'd like to answer any questions. Yeah?
You talked about this being a start into an end. Do you feel you are at your end, or will this fish continue?
That's a fabulous question. I don't know yet. I really don't know. I don't know if this did. I think I feel myself moving into some new things, but I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
I got two questions.
Okay.
The first one is, have you ever listened to Trout Master Replica by Captain Beefheart?
No?
And the second question is about the big piece in the library.
Yeah.
So there's the central figure that's like kind of an anthropomorphized trout.
Yep.
Are you drawing connections to humans and the fish, similarities between them, or
Sure.
are you pointing out differences?
I think I've been using that fish as sort of a way to think about life, if that makes sense. Like life cycle and different things, and using that as sort of a symbol for some of those things. That was the first time that I actually ever used the figure in any work. And so, it's actually a really good observation to see that connection happening actually right in front of us, for sure. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Dan?
What happens with these, who owns this work? I mean, once you uninstall it, it's not in piece anymore even. And what happens to the stuff?
Well, funny you should ask, Dan. It's in my rafters. It's in the rafters of my studio. I probably have room for one more show video there, and then I gotta get a storage unit. No, so that's the truth, right? Like things get, and actually I've gotten really good at making things small, break down very small. So like, it's really surprising how small these things get, and in terms of storing or transporting or anything like that. Some get cannibalized, but if I really like a work, I'll save it, I'll label all the wires, and so it's ready to be installed again. So hopefully I'll get to show this work again. I'm pretty pleased with it, so hopefully. Yeah, storage, that's sculpture woes right there, and the woes of being a sculptor. Yeah.
I just wonder what your home studio looks like with all this work. Like, do you work at your home a lot, or do you use the facilities at Sac City?
It depends on the scale of the work. So I can actually build quite a bit of work out of my home studio. It's really full of equipment, and then I have some open space to mock up sculptures on walls, but like this big piece here, no way could I, the big figure piece, I could not have made that in my studio at all. So that got mocked up. Most of that got built here. Like I've made the elements and then it's actually built it in the space. So I go home, fabricate, come back and install. Glenn?
It seems like when you started out, you were more of a hunter-gatherer, and now you're more of a manufacturer.
Yeah.
And I wonder, for those who are at the more hunter-gathering end, do you have any secret places that you find some of these materials?
Sure.
Or any ideas about that?
Yeah, that's actually an awesome observation. So yeah, I'm fabricating a lot of parts now rather than using majority found object. And so because I'm not as heavy into found objects anymore, I don't have as many spots, but I definitely hit a lot of antique stores. That's sort of my jam right now is, there's the Antique Trove out in Roseville. That place is massive. If you haven't been yet. Little spots all around. Nothing, I wish I had more secrets to give you on that, but I'm really fabricating a lot of things now.
I want to actually help answer that question. because
Yeah.
I've been on this journey with you for a long time.
Yeah.
Dumpster diving.
Oh, yeah.
Anytime somebody remodels a house or dumps stuff on the street, you just gotta be shameless and you gotta dig through. You'd be amazed what kind of things you find just in your neighborhood, driving around, yard sales. I mean, when we were, before fabrication, and when there's a lot of, you have a lot of other spots, but a lot of amazing things were just stumbled upon too, so.
You weren't supposed to talk about that.
In the olden
You
times.
rat me out. Yeah.
Along the same lines, what attracts you to fabricating a sound as opposed to using found sounds?
How so, like?
Well, like as opposed to recording the sound that you're thinking about and having that play, why does it feel more right to build the sound?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think material is so important to me, like the actual objects and the materials themselves, because they'll carry symbology to me. They're symbolic to me, and they're kind of weighted. And so actually having the materials in the space to me is important to the work. I don't like to go with my life hard. I think I saw it, yeah.
I noticed in your earlier work you had some like preliminary sketches that you worked from, and I was curious. I'm curious to know how much you still use that concept drawing first, and how much is preconceived and then how much is created in the space.
Sure. I draw constantly, so it's sort of pretty foundational to my practice. As far as I do draw a lot trying to come up with final forms of the work, because it's just so hard to hold a 10-foot beam and try and visualize it in space. So I try to get myself as close as I can through drawing, but then also allowing myself to respond and totally abandon that, if that makes sense. Like if I start working and the materials are just like not doing it. I mean, this piece, Skin Deep, is a really good example of that. So this piece was supposed to have a big tangled mess over the top of it, and I've been drawing it for months. Just like I wanted it to have this. So what you see going on in there on a larger scale. And so I tried it, right? We were in the space. I've got saws, I've got boards. I'm trying to build this thing out. It just wouldn't resolve. I just couldn't get it to resolve, and I realized the piece didn't want that. And so I had to abandon, thinking about it, drawing about it, and pivoting. So it's a little of both, but there is quite a bit of drawing that happens. Yeah.
I took a class at SEC before the months.
Oh, hello.
Are you still teaching there?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Still at SEC. 3D design, sculpture, if you're looking for classes. Yeah.
You mentioned humor is an element of your work, and I see that. And then you also mentioned dream, nostalgia, then you say eeriness. I think, like with the work on the screen, especially the detail on the right, it's really quite dark too.
Sure.
And the juxtaposition of the natural and the mechanical is kind of horror house element.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Is that an okay way to feel about it?
I think there's an intensity to the work that is definitely there in reads, mixed with some whimsy, some absurd, some difficult. I mean, I'm making work about kind of the full range of the life experience to me. So some of that's intense and dark, and some of that's playful and funny. And so, yeah, I think reading some of that into that's there for sure.
Because this, you could think of it as art in the age of the Anthropocene, what we've done, and the sort of torturous treatment of
Totally.
creatures.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that's a fair interpretation.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, well.
I I walked into the lakes on Sarga. Did you address then, and maybe it dovetails on Elaine's question, the significance of the iconography of the fish and how it might relate to, Catholicism or those kinds of
Not really a historical,
symbolisms?
not necessarily a historical context or symbolism, but more of the connection to kind of my personal upbringing with growing up in the logging fishing community and a specific trout farm. I got obsessed with a specific.
So not necessarily raised a good Catholic boy.
No.
More of a logger.
Yeah, more of the fishing and logging industries.
Any other questions? We have a little bit of time. Thank you. All right. Terry?
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming, and please make your way over to the gallery if now you're inspired to see the work again in person. Thank you.
Thank you all.